In the final days of April 1945, as Soviet artillery was already pounding Berlin and the Third Reich stood on the edge of collapse, Walter Schellenberg was in Sweden, physically removed from the battlefield, but not from the consequences of defeat, doing something that did not look like war. He was writing lists. Outside his window, spring sunlight danced on the surface of Lake Mälaren, and Swedish citizens walked calmly through their streets, drinking coffee and living ordinary lives, untouched by the collapse of Europe around them. It was a world of peace, standing only inches away from a world of destruction. Inside the room, however, every name Schellenberg wrote carried the weight of life and death. He listed Jewish prisoners who might still be released from German camps. He wrote down the names of Swedish and Swiss intermediaries who could open secret negotiations. He even included Nazi officials whom he believed the Western Allies might accept as bargaining partners. At 35, Schellenberg had once been the head of the SS Foreign Intelligence Service, but by the final months of the war, his authority had weakened as the Nazi system itself began to fall apart. Yet now, as the regime he had served for 12 years began to fall apart, he was trying to do the unthinkable: change sides before it was too late. The question that would follow him until his death 7 years later seems simple, but it is deeply unsettling. Was this a calculated political strategy, or was it nothing more than survival? The answer, which this story will trace through his rise and fall, is both. And in that uncomfortable combination of calculation and fear, we find something essential about the men who built the Nazi state, and then quietly abandoned it when defeat became impossible to deny. Walter Schellenberg joined the SS in April 1933, just a few months after Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. By 1934, he had entered the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the SS intelligence service led by Reinhard Heydrich. In 1942, after Heydrich's assassination, Schellenberg took control of Amt 6, the office responsible for all German foreign intelligence. His network stretched from Madrid to Stockholm. His agents operated across neutral Europe. His intelligence reports reached Heinrich Himmler and at times Adolf Hitler himself. But by late 1944, those same reports made one fact clear: Germany was losing the war, and recovery was no longer possible. In that context, Schellenberg became involved in Himmler's attempts to open contacts with the Western Allies, although his role was mainly that of a facilitator rather than a strategic decision-maker. In early 1945, through negotiations with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross, he took part in negotiations with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross, contributing to efforts that helped remove thousands of prisoners from German concentration camps in the final months of the war. When Germany surrendered in May, Schellenberg fled north, but British forces arrested him on June 12, 1945. He cooperated immediately with Allied investigators, testified at the Nuremberg trials, and in 1949 was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Released early due to illness in 1951, he died of cancer on March 31, 1952, in Turin, Italy, at just 42 years old. Between 1933 and 1952 lies a story of ambition, calculation, intelligence work, and the choices educated men made while serving a criminal regime. To understand those choices, and why Schellenberg believed he could negotiate his way out of collapse, we must return to where it all began. To a border city where German and French influences met, and to a young law student standing at the crossroads of his future. Walter Schellenberg was born on January 16, 1910, in Saarbrücken, a border city shaped by uncertainty after the First World War. Governed by the League of Nations, the city reflected both German and French influence, and families like the Schellenbergs, educated, German-speaking, and professionally minded, paid close attention to politics because stability mattered to their future. His father held a respectable position, his mother managed the household, and both believed education was the safest path to success. Walter was expected to build a stable career, and after briefly attempting medical studies, he enrolled at the University of Bonn in 1929 to study law. At Bonn, political debate was unavoidable. Germany's Weimar Republic was struggling with economic crisis, social unrest, and the lingering humiliation of defeat in 1918. Students listened to communist speakers calling for revolution, social democrats defending democracy, and nationalists demanding renewed German strength. While Schellenberg focused on constitutional law and criminal procedure, the wider political atmosphere shaped his generation. Economic instability hit the middle class hard, and young men who expected security now faced uncertainty. Some turned left, others defended democracy, but many were drawn to nationalist movements that promised order, jobs, and restored pride. These pressures formed the background to Schellenberg's early adult choices. By the time he completed his law degree in the spring of 1933, Germany had changed dramatically. Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor, the Nazi Party was moving quickly to control the state, and organizations like the SA and SS expanded across German cities. For ambitious law graduates, the new regime offered fast-moving careers inside a growing bureaucracy. In April 1933, Schellenberg joined the SS. History records the fact, not his motives. He may have believed Nazi promises, sought opportunity, or simply calculated that early alignment would bring security. Whatever the reason, the decision shaped the next 12 years of his life. His intelligence, fluent English, and analytical writing soon stood out. In 1934, he accepted a full-time position with the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service under Reinhard Heydrich. This choice placed him inside the system that enforced Nazi power, and although his understanding at the time is unclear, he stepped fully onto that path. The Sicherheitsdienst headquarters in 1934 was still an organization learning how to function. Reinhard Heydrich was building it step by step, selecting men who combined education with discipline and political loyalty, or at least the appearance of loyalty. The SD valued university graduates who could study political movements, read foreign newspapers, and understand how different groups might challenge Nazi control. Heydrich was a demanding superior. Tall, confident, and ruthless, he rewarded competence and punished failure without hesitation. He gave difficult assignments with short deadlines and observed how officers reacted under pressure. Some failed, others delivered acceptable work, and a few, like Walter Schellenberg, produced results that earned trust. Schellenberg's early work focused on Germany's internal political situation. Although the Nazis were in power, opposition still existed among communists, social democrats, and underground groups. The SD's task was not only to identify these groups, but to understand how they communicated, who led them, and where they were vulnerable. Schellenberg's reports went beyond lists of names. He explained networks, connections, and weaknesses that security services could exploit. He also proved effective when briefing senior officers. When speaking to Heydrich or other SD leaders, he avoided vague language and focused on clear conclusions. If asked about an organization's strength, he gave specific estimates. If asked about weaknesses, he identified practical opportunities. This ability to turn information into action made him valuable. By 1936, as Germany began to challenge the European order, the SD started to show a growing interest in foreign political developments, while formal foreign intelligence remained the responsibility of the Abwehr. The reoccupation of the Rhineland showed how important it was to understand French and British intentions. During this period, Schellenberg became increasingly involved in planning and supporting foreign-related intelligence work, and only later would he take part in limited missions outside Germany. The SD maintained contacts related to the Spanish Civil War, although there is no clear independent evidence that Schellenberg himself played a direct role on the ground during that period. Sweden, with its commercial connections, and Switzerland, where neutrality and banking secrecy made discreet meetings possible. In cities such as Stockholm, SD officers sometimes used ordinary public places for discreet meetings. a common intelligence practice rather than a documented event involving Schellenberg himself, ordinary enough to avoid attention, quiet enough for conversation. Information would be evaluated carefully before being sent to Berlin. Through this work, Schellenberg learned to separate reliable intelligence from rumor. Some sources provided real access and detailed knowledge. Others exaggerated or guessed. Judging credibility became one of his strengths. He also learned to manage rivalries inside the Nazi system. The Foreign Office disliked SD interference and often refused cooperation. Schellenberg responded by building independent networks, bypassing traditional channels when necessary. This independence aligned with Heydrich's goal of expanding SD influence. As war approached in 1939, intelligence pressure increased sharply. Schellenberg had become a trusted figure in foreign intelligence. That autumn, he would take part in an operation that confirmed his reputation, an operation known as Venlo. In September 1939, as German forces invaded Poland and Britain and France declared war, the British Secret Intelligence Service faced an urgent problem: how to gather reliable intelligence from inside Germany. One approach focused on making contact with German officers who supposedly opposed the Nazi regime. If such resistance existed, British intelligence hoped it could provide information and possibly weaken Hitler's rule from within. This belief was partly based on wishful thinking. British officials wanted to believe that rational men inside Germany would eventually act against Hitler, and this hope made them vulnerable to deception. Under Reinhard Heydrich's direction, SD officers worked together with other security branches to exploit this weakness in British intelligence. If the British were searching for German resistance figures, the SD would provide them, using its own officers posing as anti-Nazi conspirators. The plan was carefully developed at SD headquarters, where Heydrich, Walter Schellenberg, and others prepared the details. The targets were two experienced British agents, Captain Sigismund Payne-Best and Major Richard Stevens, operating from the Netherlands. Through controlled intermediaries, they were led to believe they could meet German officers seeking secret cooperation with Britain. In reality, these resistance officers were SS operatives under SD control. The meeting was set for November 9, 1939, in Venlo, a quiet Dutch town near the German border. The location allowed German operatives to act quickly while appearing neutral and discreet. On that cold, overcast morning, Best and Stevens arrived expecting a historic breakthrough. They were cautious, but also hopeful. What followed happened quickly. German operatives appeared with precision, seized both agents on Dutch territory, and forced them across the border into Germany. Although the operation violated Dutch neutrality, it succeeded completely. The incident stunned British intelligence. The SD gained valuable documents that revealed British methods, personnel, and communication practices. For German counterintelligence, the intelligence value was significant and long-lasting. The incident was later used in Nazi propaganda as supporting evidence against Dutch neutrality, although the decision to invade the Netherlands in 1940 was based primarily on military and strategic planning. For Schellenberg, Venlo marked a turning point. Praised by Heydrich and noticed by Himmler, he gained greater authority and rose rapidly within the RSHA, becoming a key figure in Nazi foreign intelligence. During 1940 and 1941, as German forces overran much of Western Europe, Walter Schellenberg took part in and helped coordinate intelligence activities in officially neutral countries such as Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, which had become major centers of wartime espionage. These states became major centers of wartime espionage, where agents from all sides worked under diplomatic cover or false identities while gathering information and recruiting sources. Spain was especially important. After the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, Francisco Franco's government was sympathetic to fascist ideas while publicly remaining neutral. German intelligence used Spain to observe British naval activity in the Mediterranean and to quietly encourage Spanish cooperation with the Axis, even though Franco avoided formal entry into the war. Sweden offered access to information about both Britain and the Soviet Union. Swedish companies traded across Europe, and Swedish diplomats worked in several capitals. German officers in Stockholm tried to build relationships with businessmen and officials who could provide insight into Allied industry, shipping, and military movement. Switzerland played a similar role. Its central location and strong banking system attracted representatives from every major power. Swiss banks handled financial transactions for clients on all sides, and Swiss neutrality allowed diplomats, traders, and intelligence officers to operate with relative freedom. Schellenberg's agents focused on businessmen, bankers, and officials who had regular contact with Allied governments. This work required patience. An intelligence officer might spend months building trust through harmless social contact before slowly introducing sensitive questions and, eventually, offering payment for information. Success depended on judgment, discretion, and strict operational security. Schellenberg also became involved in Operation Willy in 1940, an attempt to bring the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, into cooperation with Germany. Nazi leaders hoped the Duke, living in exile with his American wife, might support a negotiated peace. Schellenberg traveled to Spain and Portugal and met intermediaries who claimed access to the Duke, although direct contact remains uncertain. The plan failed when the Duke accepted the post of Governor of the Bahamas, removing him from Europe. Historians still debate whether the Duke was ever willing to cooperate, or whether the plan reflected Nazi wishful thinking. What the episode clearly showed was Schellenberg's readiness to use political persuasion alongside traditional intelligence work. In late May 1942, everything changed. Reinhard Heydrich was mortally wounded by Czech resistance fighters in Prague and died on June 4th. The man who had protected Schellenberg was gone, and his future now depended on surviving a dangerous reorganization without his most powerful patron. The news of Heydrich's death likely reached Schellenberg by telegram or telephone, a brief message announcing what everyone in the RSHA had feared during the previous week, as Heydrich struggled with infected wounds. For Schellenberg, the immediate question was practical. In the Nazi system, where power flowed through personal relationships and patronage, who would protect him now? After Heydrich's death, Heinrich Himmler temporarily took control of the RSHA, until Ernst Kaltenbrunner was officially appointed as its chief in early 1943. Himmler was Heydrich's superior, the man who commanded all SS and police forces throughout the Reich and occupied territories. But Himmler lacked Heydrich's sharp intelligence and operational focus. Where Heydrich had been cold, efficient, and demanding, Himmler was more interested in racial ideology, mystical theories about Germanic superiority, and managing his vast security apparatus at a high level rather than involving himself in operational details. The RSHA reorganization brought intense internal competition. Officers who had served under Heydrich now competed for position and influence under the new structure. Some sought to expand their authority by taking over offices or networks that had belonged to rivals. Others worked defensively to protect what they controlled. The headquarters in Berlin became a place of careful political maneuvering. Schellenberg's position was potentially vulnerable. He had been closely associated with Heydrich, which was simultaneously an asset and a liability. It demonstrated he had been trusted by one of the regime's most powerful figures, but it also meant he might be seen as too much Heydrich's man rather than someone loyal to the broader SS leadership. His primary rival was Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, the secret state police responsible for hunting political opponents and enforcing Nazi control. Müller was a career policeman who had served in the same role under the Weimar Republic before adapting to the Nazi regime. He and Schellenberg had never trusted each other, partly because their offices had overlapping jurisdictions and partly because they represented different types within the SS. Schellenberg, the educated analyst with foreign experience, Müller, the tough policeman focused on internal security. At meetings where senior RSHA officers reported to Himmler, the competition for influence was evident. Officers presented their division's achievements, argued for resources and authority, and watched each other for signs of weakness. Schellenberg's strategy in this environment was to demonstrate that his foreign intelligence networks were producing valuable results that justified their continued operation under his control. He prepared briefings showing intelligence his agents had gathered about Allied activities, shipping movements his Stockholm sources had reported, diplomatic developments his Switzerland officers had observed, military information obtained through various channels. The intelligence was specific and actionable, the sort of concrete information that impressed Himmler even when he did not fully understand the operational details behind it. This approach succeeded. In fact, Schellenberg had already been appointed head of Amt 6, the RSHA office responsible for foreign intelligence, in early 1942, only a few months before Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in Prague, the RSHA office responsible for all foreign intelligence operations. The promotion placed him at the center of Germany's espionage efforts as the war entered its most critical phase. His new office reflected both his authority and the atmosphere in which he operated. He had a custom desk installed, and that desk contained hidden machine guns accessible by pressing concealed buttons under the desktop. The installation of such weapons was not merely paranoia. In the RSHA, sudden arrests and purges were not unknown, and officers took precautions. The weapons sent a message to visitors. Approach carefully. By the end of 1942, at the age of 32, Schellenberg headed the RSHA's Foreign Intelligence Office, making him a key figure in Germany's espionage system, even though other intelligence services, such as the Abwehr, still operated alongside it. The Wehrmacht had been stopped at Stalingrad, and Soviet forces were beginning their long counter-offensive. In North Africa, British and American forces were gaining ground. The period of easy German victories had ended, and the intelligence reports crossing Schellenberg's desk increasingly reflected that reality. After becoming head of Amt 6, Walter Schellenberg worked to increase SS influence over Germany's foreign intelligence activities, while the Abwehr continued to exist as a separate military service. His main rival was the Abwehr, the military intelligence service led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Created during the Weimar Republic, the Abwehr followed older traditions of military professionalism that often conflicted with Nazi political demands. Canaris was a complex and mysterious figure. A career naval officer who had served since the First World War, he maintained wide personal and professional connections. Historians still debate his true political views. Some believe he sympathized with resistance elements inside the German military, while others argue he was simply a professional officer trying to serve the state, regardless of ideology. The relationship between Schellenberg and Canaris reflected this deeper divide. Their relationship reflected a deep institutional conflict, as they represented two rival systems, even though both men recognized the professional skills required for intelligence work. Canaris stood for the old military establishment, while Schellenberg represented the new SS elite. Their organizations competed constantly for authority, resources, and operational control. Schellenberg argued that Germany's intelligence work was inefficient because it was divided between the Abwehr and the SD. He told Himmler that two agencies running agents in the same countries often duplicated efforts, and sometimes even interfered with each other. A centralized system under SS control, he claimed, would be more effective. Events soon supported his position. Several Abwehr officers were accused of involvement in resistance activities. Whether Canaris himself took part remains unclear, but suspicion alone was enough. The Abwehr had already been dissolved earlier in 1944, and after the failed July 20th assassination plot, remaining officers were further purged and its functions were fully absorbed into the RSHA. This reorganization placed many former Abwehr networks under RSHA supervision, although several had already collapsed or were no longer effective. Some former Abwehr officers adapted easily, seeing intelligence work as unchanged in practice. Others deeply resented the SS takeover, viewing it as political interference in military professionalism. By late 1944, Schellenberg was among the more influential intelligence officials in the Third Reich, although his authority remained limited by the collapsing political and military system, controlling networks in neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland. These networks provided information on Allied industry, finance, and military preparation. Yet this expansion came as Germany's strategic position collapsed. Allied code-breaking had penetrated German communications, and many operations were compromised before they even began. Double agents fed false information into German networks, making reliable analysis increasingly difficult. Even accurate reports were often ignored if they contradicted Hitler's beliefs. The intelligence reports reaching Schellenberg told a clear story. Germany was losing the war. The only uncertainty was timing. This realization would soon push him toward a different goal, not serving the regime, but surviving its fall. By late 1944, the intelligence reports on Walter Schellenberg's desk showed a clear and troubling reality. Soviet armies were pushing German forces back across Eastern Europe and moving toward Germany's pre-war borders, while in the West, American, British, and Canadian troops were advancing steadily after breaking out of Normandy. At the same time, Allied air raids were destroying German cities and factories almost daily. The Wehrmacht was still fighting, but resources were shrinking, production was falling, and strategic options were disappearing. Schellenberg reviewed these reports with the calm distance he had learned through years of intelligence work. While some Nazi leaders continued to hope for miracle weapons or political splits among the Allies, Schellenberg appeared more realistic. For him, facts mattered more than ideology or wishful thinking, and the facts pointed toward defeat. He began approaching Heinrich Himmler with a carefully framed argument. Hitler's health was visibly declining, which was an observable fact rather than rumor. If Hitler became incapable of ruling, power would have to pass to someone else, and Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, was well positioned for that role. Schellenberg cautiously suggested that, if political conditions changed, Himmler might explore the possibility of limited negotiations with the Western Allies, allowing Germany to shift its remaining strength against the advancing Soviet forces. This proposal appealed to Himmler's ambitions while accepting military reality. It was not a plan for victory, but a strategy to limit defeat and preserve something from total collapse. Himmler did not immediately accept or reject the idea. Openly breaking with Hitler would have been treason, but Himmler also understood the worsening military situation, so he allowed Schellenberg to quietly explore options. Schellenberg then began preparing without formal approval. He identified which Nazi figures the Western Allies might consider acceptable negotiating partners, a list that was likely very short. He also noted potential bargaining tools, including prisoners held in German camps whose release might signal good faith. Neutral countries such as Sweden and Switzerland offered possible channels for contact. Schellenberg already had connections there, including Count Volker Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross and Jean-Marie Musi of Switzerland. These efforts were cautious and unofficial, aimed at keeping options open. Schellenberg's actions were both strategic and personal. He believed negotiations might reduce Germany's losses, but he was also preparing for his own survival after the regime's fall. Whether humanitarian concern played a real role remains uncertain, but prisoners who lived because they were seen as useful bargaining tools survived regardless of the motive. In early 1945, as the military situation collapsed, Schellenberg's quiet preparations moved toward concrete action. He encouraged Himmler's meeting with Jean-Marie Musi, who proposed facilitating the release of Jewish prisoners from German camps in exchange for financial payment to be arranged through Swiss banking channels. The historical record indicates Himmler agreed to limited prisoner releases. On February 5, 1945, about 1,200 Jews, some accounts say 1,210, were allowed to leave Theresienstadt, a ghetto camp, and they reached Switzerland. The release was structured as a demonstration, showing that prisoner transfers were possible if the Western Allies proved willing to negotiate broader arrangements. Simultaneously, Schellenberg worked to develop communication channels through Count Folke Bernadotte. Bernadotte represented the Swedish Red Cross, which gave him humanitarian credentials and access to Swedish government officials. He had previously negotiated prisoner exchanges between Germany and the Allies, establishing relationships that Schellenberg hoped to develop into political dialogue. In early May 1945, Schellenberg flew to Stockholm, and he tried to use Swedish contacts as a possible political exit as Germany's collapse became unavoidable. The contrast between Stockholm and Berlin must have been stark. Stockholm remained peaceful, its buildings intact, its citizens living normal lives. Berlin was being pounded by Soviet artillery, its streets filled with rubble and refugees fleeing west. In late April 1945, the most sensitive contacts involving the SS and Count Folke Bernadotte took place mainly in northern Germany around Flensburg and Lübeck, and Bernadotte then returned to Stockholm to brief Swedish officials and diplomats. The meetings were careful. Bernadotte maintained that his role was humanitarian, not political, and that he could facilitate prisoner releases but could not negotiate peace terms. Schellenberg argued that humanitarian actions demonstrated German willingness to cooperate and might lead to political dialogue. To support this argument, Schellenberg arranged the release of additional prisoners. Some secondary accounts state that, with Himmler's consent, Schellenberg helped organize the transfer of roughly 1,700 Jews out of German-controlled territory to Switzerland and Sweden, although sources do not always agree on the exact timing and details. The transports included Jewish prisoners, political prisoners, and others whom the Nazi regime had previously designated for death or indefinite imprisonment. The logistics were complex. Identifying which prisoners could be released required coordination with camp authorities. Arranging transportation through war-torn territory required vehicles, fuel, and safe conduct guarantees. Ensuring the transfers actually occurred required monitoring to prevent local SS or military units from interfering. Himmler approved these transfers, apparently convinced by Schellenberg's argument that they might facilitate negotiations. But when Adolf Hitler learned of the prisoner releases, his response was immediate and furious. According to some accounts, when Hitler learned that prisoner transfers were taking place, he reacted angrily and further evacuations were stopped, which prevented the effort from expanding. This order effectively ended Schellenberg's prisoner release operations. The approximately 1,700 people who had been transferred to Sweden and Switzerland represented the limit of what he could accomplish. Whether more releases might have followed if Hitler had not intervened is unknowable. The episode has generated historical debate about Schellenberg's motives. Some historians interpret the prisoner releases as evidence of humanitarian impulses, suggesting that even men who served criminal regimes could retain some moral sense. Other historians view the releases as purely tactical, a calculated attempt to create leverage for post-war survival without genuine concern for the prisoners themselves. The documentary evidence supports the tactical interpretation more strongly. Schellenberg's career had been built on calculation and pragmatism. His preparations for post-regime survival were systematic and self-interested. The prisoner releases fit within that pattern. They demonstrated good faith to potential Allied negotiating partners while creating credit Schellenberg could claim after Germany's defeat. But tactical actions can still have humanitarian outcomes. The 1,700 prisoners who survived because of these transfers were no less alive because Schellenberg's motives were tactical rather than purely humanitarian. The complexity of historical judgment lies in acknowledging both the cynical calculation and the concrete results that calculation produced. Germany signed an unconditional surrender in Reims on May 7, 1945, and the ceasefire took effect late on May 8, and a second signing in Berlin followed to meet Soviet demands. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. The regime that had promised to last 1,000 years had lasted 12, and its end came in total military defeat and complete territorial occupation. Schellenberg, along with other Nazi officials who had not committed suicide or been killed in the fighting, faced the immediate question: what now? Some officials attempted to flee to South America or other distant refuges. Some went into hiding. Some were captured immediately by advancing Allied forces. Schellenberg retreated to Flensburg, near the Danish border, where Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named as his successor, maintained a provisional government that had no real authority but continued operating for several days after the surrender. The Flensburg government was dissolved by Allied order, and its members were taken into custody or fled. Schellenberg appears to have attempted to reach Sweden, perhaps hoping to negotiate his surrender to Western allies through his Swedish contacts. He had false documents and money, standard preparations for intelligence officers facing uncertain circumstances. But escape proved impossible. Allied forces controlled all territory, and checkpoints monitored all movement. In June 1945, British forces took Schellenberg into custody in Denmark, while he was trying to arrange his own surrender. The arrest was probably straightforward: British military police or intelligence officers identifying him, taking him into custody without violence. Schellenberg was not the type to resist once the situation was clearly hopeless. His intelligence background now became relevant again, though in a different way. The British wanted information about the SS, about German intelligence operations, about networks that might still be active. Schellenberg could provide that information, and he appears to have begun cooperating immediately. Why did he cooperate so completely? Several factors likely influenced his decision. First, he had already decided that Germany was defeated, and that his priority was personal survival. Cooperation served that goal. Second, his intelligence work had always been pragmatic rather than ideological, which made transitioning to cooperation with former enemies psychologically easier than it might have been for ideologically committed Nazis. Third, he probably calculated that cooperation might reduce his eventual sentence, which proved correct. Over the following months, Schellenberg was interrogated extensively. He provided detailed information about the structure of the RSHA, the organization of Amt 6, the identities and locations of other SS officers, the operations he had run or known about, and the networks that had existed across Europe. This information helped Allied investigators understand what they had been fighting against, and helped them locate other Nazi officials. In return, Schellenberg received relatively better treatment than some other SS prisoners. He was not tortured or subjected to harsh imprisonment conditions. He was treated as a valuable intelligence source whose information justified preserving his health and willingness to cooperate. In 1945 and 1946, the Allied powers conducted the Nuremberg trials to judge major Nazi war criminals. The proceedings were intended both as legal judgment and as historical documentation, creating a permanent record of Nazi crimes. Schellenberg, who was being held by the Allies, gave testimony during the Nuremberg proceedings, where he provided information about the structure and operations of the SS. His testimony was technical and detailed. He explained how the RSHA was organized, what each department did, who reported to whom. He described the Gestapo as the main agency responsible for internal security and repression, while the SD focused on intelligence collection, although in practice their functions often overlapped. He provided information about specific operations and about what various officials had known or authorized. How he presented himself was significant. He emphasized his role in foreign intelligence gathering rather than in domestic repression or in implementing racial policies. He highlighted his late-war prisoner negotiations, framing them as attempts to moderate Nazi policy. He portrayed himself as a professional intelligence officer who had provided information to leadership but had not personally committed atrocities. This self-presentation was strategic. Every defendant and witness at Nuremberg tried to minimize their own culpability while emphasizing any actions that might appear positive. Prosecutors and judges were experienced in evaluating such testimony, understanding that people on trial would present themselves favorably. In 1949, Schellenberg appeared before a German denazification court in Nuremberg, which judged his responsibility as a senior SS official rather than conducting a full criminal trial. The charge reflected the difficulty of prosecuting intelligence officers. Their crimes were often indirect, committed through networks and subordinates rather than personally. The prosecution presented evidence that Schellenberg had been a senior SS officer holding significant authority, that he had run operations across Europe, that he had been part of a criminal organization, and that he bore command responsibility for crimes committed under his authority. The defense argued that he had attempted to moderate Nazi policy, that his prisoner releases had saved lives, and that he had worked against the regime's most extreme elements. The court sentenced him to 6 years in prison. The sentence acknowledged his position and responsibility, while also crediting his late war actions. Whether those actions reflected humanitarian concern or calculated self-interest remained, as the court noted, unclear. During and after his imprisonment, Schellenberg worked on memoirs that were later published under the title The Labyrinth. Prison offered time for writing, and he used it to compose an account of his career that would shape how history remembered him. The book, eventually published as The Labyrinth, presented his perspective on the events he had participated in and witnessed. The memoir portrayed him as someone who had joined the SS from youthful ambition rather than ideological commitment, who had tried to use his position to provide realistic intelligence to leadership, and who had worked to moderate the regime's policies when possible. It emphasized his late-war diplomatic efforts and his prisoner negotiations while downplaying his earlier participation in intelligence operations that had served Nazi war aims. Historians have used The Labyrinth cautiously. It provides valuable details about SS operations and Schellenberg's insider perspective, but it is also a self-justifying document written by someone trying to secure a more favorable historical judgment. Every claim requires verification against other sources. His health declined during imprisonment. Cancer was diagnosed. The specific type is not always clear from available records, but it was serious. By 1951, his serious illness led authorities to grant him an early release on medical grounds. He was 41 years old, seriously ill, and no longer considered dangerous. After his release in 1951, Walter Schellenberg moved to Italy and settled near Lake Maggiore in northern Italy. The region was quiet and beautiful, with mountains, deep blue water, and a mild climate that may have helped his failing health. It was also far from Germany, offering distance from the country where his name still carried weight and danger. Whatever his reasons, he spent his final months there in relative calm. People who encountered him during this period recalled that he remained mentally active and interested in politics. He followed newspapers closely, tracked Cold War developments, and commented on events as if he were still writing intelligence assessments. The habits of an intelligence officer, built over years, did not disappear even as his body failed. By early 1952, his illness had clearly reached its final stage. On March 31, 1952, Walter Schellenberg died in Turin at the age of 42. There was no public ceremony and no gathering of former colleagues. Brief obituaries in German and Swiss newspapers noted his death, identifying him simply as a former SS intelligence officer who had been imprisoned after the war. Schellenberg's legacy remains deeply contested. He built intelligence networks that served the Nazi war effort, participated in operations such as the Venlo incident, and held senior authority within the SS during its most criminal years. These facts are not disputed and place him firmly inside the machinery of the regime. At the same time, the release of an estimated number of prisoners in 1945, often cited as around 1,700 in available sources, including testimony at Nuremberg. These actions saved lives and contributed to the historical record. The debate centers on motive rather than outcome. Some historians argue that these late-war actions show that even senior SS officials could act to reduce suffering when given the chance. Others see them as calculated moves by a man who understood defeat was coming and was positioning himself for survival. The evidence suggests that Schellenberg acted only when his own future was clearly at risk. Framing his choices as either strategy or survival may be misleading. For Schellenberg, the two were inseparable. He anticipated Germany's defeat earlier than many Nazi leaders and acted accordingly, using prisoner releases and cooperation with the Allies to create leverage. His intelligence mindset shaped every decision, including those made at the end. His story illustrates a broader truth about how capable, educated men functioned within the Nazi system. Schellenberg was not a fanatical ideologue. He joined the SS as a young law graduate seeking advancement, rose through competence, and served the regime effectively for 12 years. When the system collapsed, he attempted to negotiate his way out, but those late efforts could not erase his responsibility for the crimes he had helped enable. The final question, strategy or survival, was likely the wrong one. For Walter Schellenberg, survival was always strategic, and strategy was always tied to survival. He lived by calculation, and he died the same way. If you found this account of Walter Schellenberg's rise and fall compelling, please subscribe to our channel. We explore these complex historical figures who shaped the Second World War, not to excuse their actions, but to understand how intelligent people made the choices they did, and what those choices reveal about power, ambition, and the terrible consequences of serving criminal regimes. Subscribe for more in-depth historical stories told with the detail and nuance they deserve.